Imagine a nation teetering on the brink of civil war. You've got a king with no legitimate heir, a political crisis that's tearing the country apart, and the entire future of the crown is up for grabs. Now, what if I told you that the monarchy's most powerful weapon in this whole mess wasn't an army, but a poem? I know, it sounds kind of crazy, right? But that is exactly what happened in 17th century England. So today, we're going to dive into how one writer, using just his words and a very famous Bible story, jumped right into the middle of a national emergency. So picture this. The year is 1681. England is an absolute mess. The kingdom is in turmoil, and King Charles II turns to his official spokesman, a guy named John Dryden, who happened to be England's very first poet laureate. Dryden's job was basically to use his art to defend the monarchy and try to pull the country back from the brink before it completely tore itself apart.
Okay, so to really get just how big of a deal this poem was, we first have to understand the battlefield it was launched into. This wasn't some stuffy literary debate in a quiet library. This was a full-blown political war zone. All right, so the core of the problem really boils down to two things. First, King Charles didn't have any legitimate kids to take over. That meant the crown was supposed to go to his brother, James. But, and this was a huge but, James was a Catholic, and this terrified Protestant England. The fear was that a Catholic king would just trample all over their rights and their religion. This whole thing explodes into a massive political conflict we now call the Exclusion Crisis. And this crisis didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It really kicks off in 1678 with something called the Popish Plot, which, by the way, was a completely fake conspiracy theory cooked up by a guy named Titus Oates that whipped up all this anti-Catholic paranoia. This paranoia then poured fuel on the fire of the Exclusion Crisis, where Parliament was actively trying to pass laws to block James from the throne. And right in the middle of all this chaos, in 1681, Dryden drops his poem. And as we're about to see, its warning, well, it tragically came true just a few years later. So how did Dryden pull this off? I mean, how do you even begin to tackle something like this with just a poem? Well, this is where it gets absolutely brilliant. He didn't write a dry political pamphlet. He weaponized one of the most famous stories in the Bible. He took the epic Old Testament story of King David and his rebellious son Absalom and laid it right on top of 17th century English politics. And by doing that, he completely reframed the whole debate. Suddenly, if you were against the king's brother, you weren't just making a political choice. Oh no, you were committing a sin. You were rebelling against God's own chosen order. What a move. Dryden basically handed his readers this political decoder ring, mapping all the key players directly onto these famous biblical figures. So King Charles II, he becomes King David, the wise but suffering ruler. His super popular but illegitimate Protestant son, the Duke of Monmouth, he's cast as the handsome, tragic rebel Absalom. And the real villain of the piece, the mastermind behind the opposition, the Earl of Shaftesbury, he gets the role of Achitophel, the treacherous, evil advisor. So now that the code is set, Dryden just unleashes. He uses this biblical framework to launch some of the most savage and brilliant satirical attacks in all of English literature. He wasn't just trying to argue. He was out to absolutely shred his opponents' reputations one by one. Now, how he handles Monmouth, the Absalom character, is really clever. He doesn't paint him as pure evil. He admits, yeah, the guy's charming, he's popular, he's the people's hero. But, and this is the key part, he's also fundamentally weak, a man easily manipulated by his own ambition and by sneakier people around him. He's not a monster, he's a tragic hero, which in a way makes him even more dangerous. But for the Earl of Shaftesbury, oh man, Dryden holds nothing back. There's zero sympathy here. He is the mastermind of rebellion. Dryden paints him as a cold, calculating manipulator, a man in friendship false, implacable in hate, resolved to ruin or to rule the state. It is a poetic character assassination, and honestly, it stuck. This portrait defined Shaftesbury's reputation for centuries. And he didn't stop with the big guys. Nope. He went after the whole crew. The chaotic Duke of Buckingham becomes Zimri, a guy who was into everything and stood for nothing. A rebellious sheriff becomes Shimei, and Titus Oates, the man who started all the hysteria with the Popish Plot, he gets mocked as Korah, a dangerous liar who thrives on fear. It was a complete political demolition job. So the big question is, did it work? Well, the legacy of this poem is, frankly, staggering.
It didn't just comment on history, it actively helped to shape it. Remember our timeline? Just 4 years after the poem came out, in 1685, its allegorical warning became a grim, bloody reality. The Duke of Monmouth, the real-life Absalom, led a rebellion to try and seize the throne. The rebellion was a total disaster. It was crushed, and Monmouth himself was captured and executed. And this tragic end made Dryden's poem look like a prophecy that had just come true. Its core message, that challenging the divine, lawful order only leads to chaos and ruin, had been proven right in the most brutal way possible. So when you put it all together, you can see exactly how this poem became such a powerful weapon. First, it reframed a messy political fight as a simple moral struggle between good and evil. Second, it used razor-sharp satire to just destroy the credibility of the king's enemies. Third, it powerfully defended the idea of lawful succession. And fourth, it actually helped steer public opinion back towards the monarchy during a time of crisis.
So, what are the big takeaways here? Well, for one, never ever underestimate art as a potent political tool. 2, allegory is a brilliant way to make really sharp criticisms from a position of relative safety. Ultimately, Absalom and Achitophel isn't just a poem, it's a masterclass in political satire that perfectly captured and influenced a pivotal moment in history.
Which, leaves us with a pretty compelling question for our own time. In our world of memes, tweets, and constant news cycles, could a single, carefully crafted work of art, a poem, a movie, a song, ever again hold that kind of power to shape a nation's destiny? Definitely something to think about.